Okay, so a lot's happened in the last week or so in regards to sport, and interesting to note, Messi has decided reluctantly to stay at Barcelona for another season. He doesn't want to take the club to case with legal action, such as the Bosman ruling. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Barcelona this season under Ronald Koeman. The Messi situation, it it's it is a bit of a mess. Excuse the pun. Um, Obviously, Messi is fully aware that no club is going to be able to justify spending 700 million euros on his signature. And for a player who's in his mid 30s, I don't think it was going to happen. Barcelona realised that the fact that they risked losing him, obviously, is a concern as well. A Bosman ruling would have been a legal nightmare for both parties and would have delayed any potential uh, start of Messi playing somewhere else. So a club would have to look at that going, we can't have him in our side until the Bosman ruling is complete. And so Messi staying at Barcelona. Now, what happens to Barcelona? Could there be a big club clear out under Ronald Koeman? He's got a 2-year contract. We'll have to see what happens. And we'll have to see, obviously, what signings are made and youth progression, a whole variety of things at the new camp. Um, there are concerns about the structure of the club financially, and they're not the only football club to have gone through the coronavirus badly financially. Do I watch F1? I'm not a big fan of F1 anymore. I fell out of love with the sport over the last decade or so. I think the regulations are a problem. The fact not all the cars are competitive on the grid. Whereas in other sports, in motorsport, it's a pretty even playing field. And it's more down to rider or driver skill, depending if it's motorcycles or cars, which is why I enjoy watching the NASCAR series, why I watch the V8 supercars in Australia when I can, touring cars, superbikes, motocross. There's a lot more balance in those versions of motorsport. I think F1, there's only a couple of teams that you can say can win races, and there's only one or two teams and a couple of drivers you can say are contenders for a title at the moment. Obviously, Mercedes have the most dominant car. They played the regulations very, very well, and it makes it unwatchable in the sense that there's not enough title contenders at the start of the season anymore. Even when Schumacher was at his peak, he didn't win every title. I mean, Mika Hakkinen, Villeneuve, and Damon Hill separated Michael Schumacher's first titles to his third title, and he had to battle in those intermediate years. And he did get race wins with Ferrari, but when he won his first title with Ferrari, then we got an era of dominance. Yes, I I can't see the record transfer of Neymar being broken. But yes, Wolves, Leeds, and a whole host of other clubs have signed players for around 20 to 50 million. And in that regard, we are seeing some club record transfers, but we're not seeing mega money that we have done in the last few years. I can't. This is why I think the Messi saga relates to the transfer window. Barcelona were asking for a sum of money that was unjustifiable in the current financial climate when it comes to what the coronavirus has done for not just football but for all sport financially. The amount of clubs that are reporting massive losses and the amount of clubs that are going through financial difficulty, it was an unjustifiable transfer fee that they were demanding. I think that's forced Messi's hand a little bit in not wanting to take them through a Bosman ruling, which was the other option available to both parties, and that is, excuse the pun, as I say, mess. It is a mess, a Bosman ruling. Very few players and clubs go down this route, but it is an option. But we'll have to see what happens this season under Ronald Koeman. We'll have to see what kind of squad restructuring take place and club restructuring, because there's concerns about the club structure, how it runs, how it operates, and the fact that it made such big losses in the last 5 months highlights the tenacious market that is football, but also the tenuous finances. Even a comparable club like Manchester United, again on a financial scale, is reporting losses of £5 million a day without fans in attendance. So even clubs that are in a good financial health are suffering losses as well. Do I think Jimmy Anderson goes on the next Ashes tour? That's an interesting point. I did watch the English innings in the ODI today against Australia, and England dominated that match. Australia, their upper order batting collapse did for them in their slow run rate. T20, you can see some big scores scored. I didn't watch the Australian innings. I was watching the Tour de France, which again in itself is interesting with the backdrop of the pandemic and what's going on and concerns that the Tour might not actually be able to finish. I mean, Team Ineos stated that yesterday they tested all their riders, including Bernal, last year's Tour winner, and they're awaiting their test results. And it will be interesting to see when a rider tests positive what the Tour organisers do. Bear in mind the Vuelta is next month. It will be exceptionally interesting to see what happens if a rider or riders test positive at the Tour de France. Tomorrow is a rest day, so that'll be interesting to see. There are some riders struggling. Um, you know, it's it's a difficult one because in pro cycling, fans can just be at the side of the road. There's a lot of interaction with the fans. They are very, very close, especially on the mountain stages, as we saw the last couple of days in the Pyrenees. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I think Jimmy Anderson goes on the next Ashes tour? I think the problem with the Ashes is it's too regular these days. I think the Cricket Australia and the ECB have flogged the England Australia rivalry to death. They've overplayed it. But yes, Jimmy Anderson, I still think he's got something to give to the test side. He's obviously now taken 600 test wickets. I think it is very plausible that he could get 620, 650 wickets should he stay fit in the next 12 months. But I think next year will be his last year as a test player. Whether he goes on the Ashes tour or not, I don't know. That's up to the selectors and Jimmy Anderson himself and the coaching setup with England. But his form against Pakistan shows that he's still got a lot of give, even at his age. I think he's 37 now. So he's still got enough energy in the tank to play at the top level. But is the Ashes tour a step too far? We'll have to wait and see how and when he decides is his last test. But with the performance of the Australians today, I think Australia have their own issues. They were completely outclassed today. Having not watched, however, their innings, I can't discuss their innings, but I can discuss England's batting and how they just utterly dismantled the Australian attack and Joss Buttler quite easily, controlled the innings with a good performance, a good selection of shots. He's a very attacking batsman. There's discussion about should Joss Buttler be a Test wicket keeper. Yeah, Bairstow with him as well at the crease for a point. So that's an interesting one. I think, some of the other Test nations, such as Ireland, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, we've just had Test series against the West Indies, New Zealand as well, who are, I think, a better side than Australia right now when it comes to Test cricket. I think I think the ECB and Cricket Australia have overflogged. They flogged the Ashes rivalry to death. It should be as it used to be, as a bit of a traditionalist. I think they've overdone it. They've oversold it. They've really forced this England Australia. They overplay the rivalry too much. I think it's lost a little bit of its luster from when I was a kid growing up watching Mark Butcher's century. And England lost in that series 3-1 back in the early 2000s. The 2005 series was a good watch as well. But I think the ECB and Cricket Australia have milked the cash cow, and I don't think it necessarily has benefited the sport or the rivalry. I think there's too much familiarity between the players. I think other Test nations do deserve Test series against Australia and England on a more frequent basis. Bangladesh are a good side. You could argue Afghanistan deserve a Test against England or a two or three Test series. We know Ireland have played a Test match against England. I think they deserve a little bit of recognition on the international stage. They are Test nations, but that's up for the Test organisers. The ECB has got other issues as well concerning the TV rights. Yes, we've got some free-to-air one-day T20 cricket on the TV, but that is not what it used to be. I think there needs to be shared rights between the satellite broadcasters and the free-to-air broadcasters when it comes to Test cricket. I think that will increase the audience again. We saw with the Cricket World Cup final the highest TV audience since 2005 because it was on free-to-air TV, and Sky don't like to admit that. The ECB don't like to admit that the reason why the viewing figures were so high was it was more accessible. The problem is some of these free-to-air broadcasters are struggling financially, and that's another concern when it comes to TV rights at the next bout of negotiations coming up. We've seen, obviously, in the last 6 months, concerns about a lot of broadcasters, including the satellite broadcasters with some financial concerns. And going forward, the relationship between sport and the media is going to be interesting to see what happens. Do I think England versus Exiles Rugby League International Series will return? I think rugby league itself has issues with its international selection policies and the sport itself. I think the NRL has come out of the coronavirus shutdown in a far better and healthier state than the Super League and the RFL over here. The NRL and the Australian Rugby League Commission has seen a new CEO for the NRL. Peter V'landys has managed to get the sport up and running again. The competition has restarted. We've seen rule changes that are positive for the game. Fans are already back in stadiums in a limited capacity, obviously, but it shows what can be done with strong governance, both from the politicians, which we're lacking over here in Europe, and from the sports governing bodies as well. It shows what good, firm, authoritative governance can do. What we've seen is really poor sports governance. That's not being held to account because the money's been coming in. Now that there is a crisis, sport is struggling to adapt to said crisis and has dealt with it in a less than satisfactory manner. But the fact that the RFL have to go to the government in order to secure a loan of only 16 million, it's not a lot of money. Rugby league in this country has a image problem and a sales pitch problem, and one of the reasons it has an issue is it's a regional game, but it has a phobia, it seems, of expanding into wealthier areas of the country. And I get criticised for saying that, and I'm a southerner and I love rugby league. I like watching the Challenge Cup final. It's a religious thing for me, watching the Challenge Cup final every year. The fact that the nearest professional team is the London Broncos, to me, and then you've got the London Scholars, and apart from that, in the south of England, there's nothing. And the RFL has got to look at itself and go, right, if we want to be taken seriously and increase revenues and increase the player base, we have to expand. And the right way to do that is through schools, through amateur clubs, and through looking at new investment options, which is expansion. Do I think the England versus Exiles Rugby League International Series will return? Rugby league's got bigger problems than that. Yes, it might be interesting, but how do you market that to the international and the British audience, considering that the TV deal that the Super League has is not worth a lot of money? The Super League does not have the finances that the NRL does. The TV deal the NRL has signed with Foxtel and Channel 9 is worth 3 times, 4 times as much as the TV deal over here per season. And that tells you all you need to know about the finances of rugby league. They're not in a healthy state. And a lot of teams will struggle without fans being in grounds. And all we know is provisional dates set out by the Scottish and UK governments for fans being allowed back into stadiums and arenas. And without full capacity being allowed, financially, these teams are going to struggle, and struggle quite badly. And a sport without fans is just a hobby played by enthusiasts. That's my opinion on it. A sport with no fans is just hobbyists playing a game, and that is in itself a problem. And while there are sporting events taking place and we as sports fans can get our fix, not being allowed to go to stadiums and not being allowed to go into arenas and watch as fans is an option that obviously we want. And in order to get that, the infection rate has to drop. A whole variety of other things have to happen. And we don't even know if seasons are going to take place in some sports or be completed. We just don't know what's going to happen. The last 5-6 months has been a complete mess. These sports and governments all knew what was happening in China over Christmas and the New Year, and were very poorly prepared for what happened in March and April. Very poorly prepared. The Newcastle United takeover, you ask this question every week. Nothing new's happened. It's still owned by Mike Ashley. There's still uncertainty about the future of Steve Bruce and how much, what kind of squad is going to be taking the field and how competitive that team is going to be. The fan base is exceptionally loyal. We know this. And it's only in the last season or two that fans have started actually boycotting games in the numbers that should have been happening a lot earlier to get change. He's not been a very popular owner, but I've covered this, and I do think the way the Premier League and the FA handled the takeover discussions and the takeover talks, there needs to be more transparency in the whole process. This is a lot of money. This is big business. This is more than just sport. It's actually a local employer. Every football club is part of its community where it's based. I think fans across the board, when it comes to football takeovers, there needs to be more transparency in the process. How you do that, I'm just a fan on the outside looking in, but I do think there needs to be more transparency in the process and a lot more accountability in the process as well. And there were concerns about who would be the chairman of the club, and I find that is a valid concern that was raised out of that process. But the fact they dragged it out for the best part of 3 months is not great when it normally takes 2 to 4 weeks to come to a decision. That took 3 times too long. Questions have to be asked about, did they use the coronavirus as a pretext to drag out the takeover discussions and the review of the takeover bid? We also know there are other active bids on the club, and there should be no reason why Newcastle United as a club itself is not profitable. You look at that fan base and the loyalty they have week in, week out. Every season, that stadium is full of noise, passion, and there's rarely an empty seat. So whoever ends up owning that club knows they've got a solid fan base in the Northeast. And in the past, in the 90s, Newcastle were one of the biggest clubs in Europe. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget they nearly won the Premier League, and they did pretty well in European competition, and they got to FA Cup finals. They were challenging for trophies in the mid to late 90s. That fan base is one of the most loyal fan bases you will see. One of the most fanatical fan bases you will see. The mismanagement of the club under Mike Ashley and the bad negative press coming out of there, and the fact there have been multiple takeover attempts and there are still open and valid bids that are at various stages of negotiations, says that there's obviously an interest in that club because a potential owner knows that club will be profitable. It will be profitable. It is profitable. It should be profitable. What then happens next? I don't know. Whether Peter Kenyon comes back with a renewed bid, we know he's somewhere in the pipeline. There are other unnamed bids that are at various stages. I wouldn't be surprised if a similar bid comes along for a similar valuation between 300 and 350 million pounds for the club. I think a bit at the lower end because of the coronavirus. But Mike Ashley is now in a position where he can't really ask for too high a price. He needs to sell because of his other business interests. Did I watch any sport? Yes, I watched a fair bit of the NRL. I watched a fair bit of the Tour de France. I'm actually getting really interested in watching this Tour de France, not because of any particular reason. I think Adam Yates holding yellow is only the 9th English or British rider to do so in the history of the Tour de France, which in itself surprises me. I thought there were more. But the race itself, it's more open this year, and I think the pandemic has done something with that. You've got Roglic, I think, is now the yellow jersey holder. It's a very open race. Adam Yates lost some time today, lost the yellow jersey. The Pyrenean stages have really blown the race wide open. There is no overall favourite. Thibaut Pinot, he's not very well, it seems. He's struggling. There's several French riders with a good chance, which is always healthy for the sport. Team Ineos, formerly Team Sky, don't look as dominant this year, which I think is a positive. I think it's a more balanced playing field. Should have Geraint Thomas and Chris Froome been there to challenge? That's open for debate. The opinion is split on especially on Chris Froome and his wins and how legitimate they are and allegations of doping, but that goes across the sport. So, Contador is a prime example of someone who was caught doping multiple times and allowed back in. So again, you have to take that with a pinch of salt. The aftermath of the Lance Armstrong era is still here with us when it comes to pro cycling. There's still always that bit of doubt about a rider's integrity or team's integrity when it comes to doping regulation. I do believe doping in cycling is a lot less now than what it was 20 years ago. But I think it's a very open race this year. There's already been a lot of crashes and a lot of Uh, there's been a lot of crashes and a lot of incident. But there are concerns that the race may not be able to be completed because of the coronavirus and the rising infection rate in France. So we'll have to see if the race can go its full 3-week term and in 2 weeks' time finish on the Champs Elysees. We've got a rest day tomorrow. It'll be interesting. Team Ineos are publicly saying that they've tested all their riders for the virus. I wouldn't be surprised if other teams are also going through and paying to have their riders tested, because it will be interesting to see what happens with the ICI if a rider tests positive, or riders, especially from multiple teams. If it's one team, I think you can contain it, but if it's multiple teams, then there's a bigger concern that it may decimate the peloton. And because the peloton is such a tightly packed formation, you are very close contact and very close proximity with your rivals and other cyclists. So that's going to be a very close proximity with fans. Other sport, I've watched a lot of NRL. It's getting very interesting. The Penrith Panthers winning 12 in a row. They're going to be minor premiers, I think. Melbourne and the Roosters winning, I think, solidifies their places in the top four. Canberra losing to the Roosters, I think, is a big one. The Rabbitohs losing. So the top 4 or 5 places, I think, are getting pretty set. Newcastle bouncing back. There's been a lot of incident in some of the games. The West Tigers winning a thriller against the Manly Sea Eagles. Brisbane Broncos looking like they may get a wooden spoon, but it all depends on the Bulldogs. But the Bulldogs have a lot of injuries, and they've now losing one of their best players in Kerrod Holland, announcing his retirement because they wouldn't re-sign him. So the NRL is getting interesting. The Broncos is still they're still not sure who's going to be their next coach. So their lack of a decision on a coaching standpoint is a concern, because if they are to rebuild themselves, it could take longer. To get that rebuild in place and sort out that playing group. Other than that, I haven't watched too much sport. It's mostly been the Tour de France and the NRL. I've still got to watch some of the games from the weekend. But it is what it is. I think the Premier League starting in a week's time is going to be interesting. And the football season in general. We've already seen qualifying rounds of the FA Cup taking place. We've already seen League Cup games taking place. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this coming football season. Obviously, the disruption to the end of last season and the fact that only the Premier League and the Championship resumed is still a bitter pill for some and divisive for some. There are concerns about football finances at the lower level. They've had to restructure the League Cup and the FA Cup for this season, so there's going to be no replays at all, which will affect the lower league clubs when it comes to finances. Again, if they can, with the TV money and if and when crowds are allowed back in, there's no winter break. So the football season's been slightly restructured. Rugby league, they're persisting with the Challenge Cups. When the Challenge Cup final comes around, it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out. But yeah, Japan withdrawing from the 8 Nations mini tournament, and could Georgia replace them? That the Rugby Union international calendar has been thrown into the air. So there's a lot going on when it comes to restructuring sporting events, and questions are still being asked whether the Olympics and the Euros will take place next year. They're still open-ended questions. The Rugby League World Cup takes place this time next year. So again, these big international sporting events, there's question marks over whether they'll take place or not. And the TV companies are concerned because they've invested a lot of money into these events. The event organisers are concerned because they're expecting revenues. The ECB's 100 tournament, which no one really wants anyway, was already predicted to make a loss. That's, again, we're not even sure if that's going to take place. So there's a lot of questions there. Do I listen to 5 Live? I do occasionally. I haven't listened to 5 Live for a while. I listened to it more when I was younger, ironically, and that's weird for a young person to say. I'm 30, but I don't mind listening to the radio when it comes to sport and general talk radio. Actually, to be fair, that can be kind of interesting. I've actually been on the radio before when I've done it on a phone in to do with a couple of issues when LBC was listenable back in the day. I've been on a couple of LBC phone-ins back in the days of Yorick, when I was, I think, my early to mid 20s. Five Live, I haven't listened to it recently, but it was regular listening in the car, going down to the beach or travelling. I would regularly listen to Five Live, especially on the way home from football or rugby matches. I would listen to Five Live because I would always go to the lunchtime kickoff primarily, and you would always listen to the radio to the afternoon and the evening kickoffs. So depending where I was travelling from, I used to listen to it. I've listened to a couple of test matches on Five Live. I do like listening to cricket on the radio. That is a real good listen. And that's a sport you can listen to on the radio, and visualise it. But I think with what's going on with TalkSport, I have tried to listen to TalkSport since Alan Brazil stepped down from Mondays to Wednesdays. It is not good listening. Politics and sport is a dangerous mix, and it's clearly divided a lot of people. I look on social media and the reaction is not positive. The Sky Sports lineup changes with Letizia and Thompson and co getting basically shuffled out and removed from their panel show on Saturday, Soccer Live. That's created a lot of division. It's interesting. I mean, sports commentaries and then sports punditry is getting interesting. Again, this is the negativity of having politics in sport. I don't necessarily miss the old Five Live. I think if they're good enough to be the commentators and the hosts and the reporters, so be it. They should be there on merit. I've never said, I mean, because some of my favourite sports editors are female. Some of my favourite sports reporters are female. I've got nothing against diversity on the radio, on the TV, or on the internet. What gets me is when it's forced and when the people are only promoted because of their gender, the colour of their skin, or their background. That's where I have a problem. A lot of the other people are just hiding the fact that they are racist and bigoted. But I even complaining about it. I have seen a lot of criticism of some of the decisions taken by some of the broadcasters in regards to their presenting lineup, their commentary lineup. I'm of the opinion if they are good enough, they'll get there on their own merit. But I think the way it's been handled, it could have been handled a lot better by Sky and by the BBC and by ITV and by Channel 4 and how they hire their presenters and the criteria behind it. I think a lot of them have made a bit of a PR nightmare behind it. TalkSport has become, well, just look at the viewing or the listening figures. It's not great. What do I think of esports, clips and sports in the future? Well, there has been a rise in esports, obviously with the lockdown over the last 5 months. It is a big business. It makes a lot of money. There is a passionate fan base for it. It's something that I've got to look into. I have to admit, it is something that I have to look into, is the esports side of things. It has grown in popularity in the last 5-10 years. And some of the games they play are actually, some of the games they play are actually kind of fun. And it's kind of fun to watch some of these esports tournaments. I've watched a couple on Twitch a few years back. It is a growing thing, but I still think there will be a space for it in the future. I think sports themselves could work a lot more with the esports side of things to grow both fan bases, and it's big money. So I think whether it over eclipses in the future or not, I don't know. But there's definitely been a growth of it in the last 5-6 months, which has been noticeable. And whether it's all positive or not, we'll have to wait and see long term. But I think it's noticeable. There's been a big growth in organised esports over recent years, and in the last 6 months, massive growth in the participation of esports. But are they athletes? Now, I think esports as a term is a bit disingenuous. They are video gamers. They are gamers. It is a passionate hobby for a lot of these people, and some of them make some real good money out of it. The big tech companies are starting to really advertise and push it. online tournaments. It's becoming a bit more mainstream. I can't. You could call them computer athletes. I don't know if you can call them athletes because obviously athletic. The definition of the word athlete obviously means physical exertion on the field. But I think it's something to seriously consider going forward. There's a big growth in it. There's a big untapped potential there, and it's something anyone can take up. Is video gaming. If you really want to, anyone can do it. You're not barred from doing it per se. All depends on your internet connection. I'm more of a casual gamer these days. I don't play as religiously as I used to. The older I've got, the less I play video games. But there is a debate about the future of esports and in society. So it's an interesting one. I wouldn't call them athletes. I'll call them participants. But it is an interesting dynamic. How are Wolves getting away with having 2 English players in their squad? Well, is that including their development squad and their youth squad? I think there are obviously rules they have to abide by with match day squads. Yes, Wolves are signing a lot of Portuguese and Spanish players, but you have to look at their coach and his background. I think the FA needs to look at representation from the home nations when it comes to playing squads and player development and increasing pathways for the youth setup. I think they need to look at capping the number of overseas players, but then that becomes a little bit of an anti free movement policy, and then the right. It's a complicated issue, but I do think there needs to be I wouldn't say necessarily a quota system, but they need to look at encouraging clubs to sign more or develop more local talent. And I think that will be a trend that we will end up seeing long term with the financial constraints that the last 6 months have shown, is that clubs are going to be more reliant on developing local talent. And the way football is structured and financed is going to have to change. There's a reason why Messi's still at Barcelona. No one could justify that. Yeah, it is. I think the issue with football is such a global sport that it can be played by anyone. I have no issue with a club signing a load of foreign players, as long as they have enough players in their system who are local. And you could argue that about any country. Some leagues are more heavily reliant on overseas talent than others. Some leagues do have quota rules. Other leagues encourage more homegrown developed talent. So, I mean, you have to look at the league systems. In Germany, the average percentage of German players who are eligible to play for Germany, that means they are eligible to play for the German national side, is around 60%. In England, it did drop as low as, I think, 30% on a match day. It's risen somewhat. But I think we're still lagging behind when it comes to local player representation. You just have to look at how successful the German national side has been in comparison to the English national side in all youth levels and all levels of the game. It's the way the clubs are run as well. The fact the Premier League is the most lucrative league to play in has a big draw for players. But I do think there is an over-reliance on overseas players by a lot of clubs, and we have to look at the youth systems and why they're not producing the talent that is required. I mean, Huddersfield shut down their youth academy because bigger clubs were poaching their players. We have to look at youth development, and when you say that rubbish foreign players are stopping English players, but how good are those English players? There's a reason why they're not getting the first team squads, and it's because they're not good enough. And that again comes down to the youth development policies of clubs, and also to a certain extent education system. We've argued this before, that grassroots development and grassroots funding is crucial to developing talent. We've seen that in a variety of sports. There's a reason why some sports are growing really well, or were growing really well before the lockdown, and other sports were struggling to adapt. I think there are some really good young English players. yes, the argument is that some clubs are overly reliant on foreign talent. Um, but some players are very good at youth level, and it doesn't translate to senior level. We've seen this in so many sports. There's been a lot of young, talented players that break through in the first couple of seasons and seem really good. And I always use examples like Danny Cipriani in rugby union. Prime example of a really talented build as the next Tony Wilson kind of player. Hasn't quite transitioned that into the senior game. He's still a brilliant fly half, centre, sometimes come fullback. But you look at Danny Cipriani, and it hasn't quite transpired at the same level of peak that Wilkinson and Hodgson and other fly halves has had. And he did have his chance, and he blew it. You could say Quade Cooper for the Australian side, again labelled as like the next Stephen Larkham fly half, in the sense that he was going to be the next dominant fly half for Australia, and it didn't work out at all. And a lot of that is to do with they're getting paid more. They off-field antics have derailed a lot of careers. Some people argue that some of these young players are paid too much too quickly, and that's not just football, but that's across sport. And the playboy image lifestyle that's portrayed in the media for like some of these big superstar players in Hollywood and in real life is not generally how it is. They're not educated. Some of these young kids grow up in a bubble where they're scouted at a very young age, and they're paid a lot of money in comparison to kids their age who may not have such good job prospects. Some of them are very badly advised. And yes, in some sports, yes, there is an over-dependence on overseas talent. And if you look at global sport as a whole, yes, I think there is a massive problem with especially British sport, especially with football. There is an over-reliance on overseas talent, and part of the reason for that is A, we invented the sport, and B, very lucrative, lots of foreign investment. They want to sell to their domestic markets. That leads to foreign players wanting to go there. They can earn the highest wages. Is the football the best? Is it the best league in the world? It's more competitive than some of the other European leagues for title wins for teams, but is it the best league in the world for quality? Debate's open on that. Sorry, NHL starts in December. The Elite League's not confirmed. Yeah, well, the issue is with the NHL, it does have a TV deal. It has TV deals that can create income, which can mitigate some of, which can mitigate some of the financial losses or financial burden. The Elite League doesn't have the same media rights deal, and it's a smaller sport in comparison to percentage of players of sports. Sports stars in the country. Obviously, football's the dominant sport. Cricket and rugby union, rugby league rank higher in participation because it is what it is. On the side of the Elite League as well, there are concerns about where teams are going to play. If arenas are going to be like Glasgow, they've got an issue with their arena. Fife has an issue with signing players. At the next tier down, we've seen Bracknell Ice Rink shut. Basingstoke Ice Rink's in a poor state of repair. There are concerns about the infrastructure of the sport in this country as well, and that's something that needs to be addressed going forward. We discussed it, obviously, the last live stream about the infrastructure issues that the sport faces. There are concerns that we may not have enough players to form squads, and a lot of foreign players will leave, partly because of the political situation with Brexit and partly because of the pandemic and visa situations. The whole thing is a mess. I think that is a concern about the infrastructure and the finances of the sport, and whether the sport has to go through another reorganisation in the future, we'll have to wait and see. Very few teams are very profitable. And it's a shame because the sport has seen massive growth in the last 5-10 years. And unfortunately, this pandemic has really put the brakes on that. Well, I don't know. I don't understand Wolves' thinking here, because I can't see how these clubs can justify. Well, if they had, I can't see how they would justify that. Not that I've been following the transfer market. The only real interesting story is what's happening with Lionel Messi at Barcelona. But yes, some clubs like Leeds and Wolves have broken their club transfer records in signing players. They're still not the biggest signings we've ever seen. As I say, I can't see the Neymar transfer record being broken, and I think Barcelona, have obviously. Oh, I mean, the fact that you know the question marks over overseas money in the English game have obviously been raised with the Newcastle takeover and all these overseas tours that these clubs have now missed out on, and how they're becoming more and more. Um, how the overseas tours to especially Asia are becoming more and more common. I'm not sure how fans feel about that. Yes, there's a lot of overseas investment in the English game, and is that can you argue that has that all been good? Um, but the fact that the Premier League has just lost 600 million from its kitty bank is concerning because you know I wouldn't say it needs to distance itself from China. I think the Chinese sports market and how much they invest, and how much they buy into, and how much merchandise they sell, and TV rights do, and everything like that. The Chinese middle classes loves the Chinese people love sport. Let's not kid ourselves. The political side of it, this is where politics and sport should not mix. Really shouldn't, because it's harming both sides economically. Sport should be a great equaliser. I do have concerns about some of the overseas money and where the money comes from, and the transparency of the process of club ownership. And what we've seen is some really shocking club ownership across the board, from the Premier League down to the non-league, for decades, and it gets worse. More clubs are getting into financial strife now than before 1992. So, could you argue the overseas money in the Premier League has been a good thing for football? Yes and no. So, that's a concern in itself. Is look at the Wigan Athletic situation. Look at Macclesfield. Look at Bury. Look at Bolton. You could look at other clubs like the Portsmouth situation about a decade ago. What happened with Leeds? Some of the foreign takeovers that have been questionable with the amount of debt raised upon clubs that were profitable. I'm talking from a Blackburn fan's perspective here with the Venkies. The club debt has skyrocketed under them. The fact that an individual player has been told by his league not to say anything of his own personal opinions is concerning. I know when a player signs a contract with teams, I do know of this. They obviously have to. There is an integrity clause about what they can say about officials, and some players have been very outspoken in various sports and been heavily fined and suspended for bringing the sport into disrepute. But when you have a league, one of the most profitable leagues in the world, telling one of its star players, one of the biggest draws that they have as a marketing tool, not to say what he feels, that is concerning. That is concerning, and it shows how the globalization of sport hasn't always been a good thing. I feel concerned that if that is truly the case, and that is true reporting by the media, because we know the media do like to make 70% of their stories up and not be fully truthful when reporting things, that if he has been basically censored from airing his concerns about a variety of issues that the sport may face, that is a concern. I'm not. I wouldn't sit happy. That wouldn't sit happy with me. But we've seen in recent times coaches and players get fined by the various sports that they play in for some of their press conferences. When Charlie Austin had his little rant about the VAR situation a couple of seasons ago when he was playing for Southampton, he copped a fine from the FA. We've seen coaches get fined for some of their comments about refereeing and finances and integrity of sports. So we have seen outspoken players and coaches get fined for basically speaking their views and their opinions in the heat of the moment. But when you can actually say, don't say anything negative about this particular organisation, they're the ones not making the rules. They're not the rule makers. They are investors. And if you have a concern about an investor, I think you personally should be allowed to air your views on a subject, because LeBron James is the biggest asset that the NBA has. And if he has concerns about how the NBA is financed and run and who invests in it, I think he should be allowed to air his views, regardless of the implications. Because yes, there are concerns about Chinese money in sport. Plain and simple. That's my opinion. Do I think Ronnie O'Sullivan will get a seventh world title? It's plausible. It's doable. Um, it all depends on his mentality and how long he decides to keep playing on the main tour before he goes to the seniors tour, does seniors events. It's doable. Uh, whether he decides, because he's retired before, he's taken time out of the sport before, so it's all down to him. Uh, Personally, I feel that it's doable, but there's a lot of good snooker players now. That the quality in global snooker now is a lot higher than what it was when O'Sullivan. Um, when O'Sullivan first burst on the scene, he was the wonder kid. The quality level of the opposition now and the amount of good quality players is a lot higher now. The sport's gone through massive growth, so he's going to face tougher competition and stiffer opposition to do it a seventh time, but it's doable. It's all up to him, though. It's whether he wants to keep playing at that elite level. And we've seen in tournaments where he's not been in the right mindset and he's walked out. He's retired from matches. He's not played well. Snooker's a lot of mental games there. I'm seeing all this political stuff come through, and yes, the BLM movement, how sports latched onto it and gaslight the situation, and how the slogan and the actual political social movement are two different things. Let's remember that in mind. When Colin Kaepernick took the knee in 2016, I had nothing against that. He was protesting against what he saw was social injustice. That's fine. What's happened is a far left Marxist organisation has hijacked social issues for political gain, and big sports leagues and sports stars who have not actually really been as affected by the social issues that America and the world faces. Because again, a lot of the NBA and these NFL players have been in a bubble since they were 16 years old. They've been scouted before they go to college. They've been offered college contracts before they go there and college bursaries. They have been basically in a bubble since the age of 16, maybe even younger. They haven't had to work the 9 to 5 warehouse job. They haven't had to work on the bread income line, bread line. Actual and real poverty are different things. So I don't know. I don't like how political movements have hijacked professional sport. We've seen it in Olympic sport, political pressure being involved with the IOC. It doesn't sit well with me. We've seen political interference in sport before. It doesn't sit well with me at all. It's a very tricky minefield. And while there are some really, admirable people who really are, trying to stand up to stamp out discrimination, racism, homophobia, so highlight social issues and using sport as a tool. And these are actual sports. Marcus Rashford's done amazing things with his less than advertised school meals pledge and working with local charities and working with local MPs and local councils to basically make sure kids don't starve, plain and simple, make sure kids can go to school and working with disadvantaged families. I think that is a far better way of doing things than some of the other politics in sport, and that's a positive. And he started in his local community where he's been brought up, and yes, he's a very gifted football player, and yes, he's been in this bubble, but he actually is fully aware of what's going on socially around him. What Marcus Rashford has done is completely different to the BLM and the kick it out and the rainbow laces and all these gaslighting by these professional sports. How's it going? Yeah, it's busy with work. Busy. It's all good. Well, look, I haven't really followed the Super League since it's returned. I think the issue with rugby league is it could be more inclusive. You look at the fan base and you look at the player base of English-based players, and there's not many players from minority backgrounds playing. Let's be honest. Rugby union's leading the way there. I think looking at how the NBA dealt with things, I mean, there are players' unions. We've had the discussion. I'm going to talk about English sport now, but we use it as an example. The Kick It Out campaign has been going for over 25 years. The Rainbow Laces campaign transcends sport. Okay, so these are two organisations that have been active in battling and educating about discrimination and trying to make it a level playing field. And, you know, colourblind and genders, you know, sexuality is irrelevant. If these two existing bodies were successful in their mission statements, there would be no racism in football. There would be no homophobia or sexism in football. It's not worked. Why is it then that there was still racism in the football stands and on social media? Why is it then that there's very few openly gay sports stars? Ask yourself that question first. These organisations have been well established. They are apolitical, so there's no real politics behind it. They are endorsed by all across the political spectrum for the mainstream. Yet we are not breaking down those barriers with mainstream backing and with the majority of fans being on board with these campaigns for inclusivity and ending discrimination. And yet they're not working because we're still having these issues every season. And now with social media, Christ, it's I mean, yes, this is social media we're using now, but it's not great. I mean, when I do a match review, I will be critical of players and how they're playing. I'll be critical of coaches and how they set up their tactics. That doesn't mean I think these players are terrible. They're far better than me than what they're doing in rugby union, rugby league, and football and cricket. No debating that. But I can still be critical of a player's performance. Going, David De Gea is not having a good time right now in goal for Manchester United in Spain. He's not been playing well for about 2.5, 3 seasons. That's not just me criticising him. Everyone's picked up on that. I could look at Danny Cipriani and how his international career is basically fallen apart because his off-field antics. That's been going on for over a decade. The mainstream media has picked up on that. Fans have picked up on that. He's a very talented player. His colourful off-field life has, I think, detracted from his skills on the field. You could look at Marcus Rashford and Raheem Sterling and the World Cup debate in 2018, when the media had a bit of a perverse interest in Sterling. I was critical of Sterling because his finishing was so poor and his distribution and bringing other players into play was so poor. I was one of the few people who said, give Rashford a chance. And I looked at social media and I looked at YouTube. And a lot of people were criticising Sterling, but very few of them were saying, well, get Rashford into the team. A lot of the media were, but they were accused of being racist and having a perverse interest in Sterling's life and some of Sterling's choices. Yes, he's a role model, but I think he's free to spend his money how he wishes. If he wants to buy his mum a house, he can buy his mum a house. If he wants to get a stupid tattoo on his leg crossed, I've got stupid tattoos all over me. I don't give a toss what people think. You know, that's his personal decision. But I think his playing form in 2018 was not good enough at international level. At club level, he's a lot better because it's a different system he plays and all sorts. Wakefield Trinity. That, again, I haven't watched the Super League since resumption. I prefer the NRL. That's a personal, obviously, opinion and a personal viewpoint. I will say this. I think there are different ways to show that you're unhappy with things that are going on social. To enforce and basically castigize people for not following your trend in how you protest is wrong. I think they can still say we are against this without having to take a knee. And in some cultures and some national cultures, we have to be respectful because we've always got to be respectful of people's cultures and how they deal with things. Especially in some countries, taking a knee is seen as a sign of weakness and as a sign of subservience, which is what they're battling against. I think the issue is, the silent majority doing nothing. That's the problem. People are going, well, I don't want to get involved for a variety of reasons. And a lot of people have a fear of getting involved because it could escalate the situation, make things worse. And that is fair. But I look at football stadiums, and when I've been going to games, I've been going to games since I was 7 years old, on and off. I stopped going. Did I hear racist abuse being heard of players? Not as much as you think. It's not as big a problem as you think. It happens. Did I hear it? Yes. Did I hear it every game? No. That's interesting. I've sat with the Burnley fans, and Burnley get a bad rep for this. I've sat with 2,000 Burnley fans at Watford. Did I hear any racist abuse from them? No. Did I hear some pretty foul language? Yes. Did I hear homophobic abuse? I heard a few homophobic slurs. Would you call it actually targeting a single player? No. Would you call it if a player died? Did they call him a puff? Yes. I think the definition of banter has changed. I do think though that I do have a concern that yes, because I haven't been in football for over a decade, I can't comment on what's happening in stadiums right now. But I've been in rugby, I've been in ice hockey, I've been in cricket, and I will say this quite openly: I've never heard any racist or homophobic abuse aimed at players in rugby union and ice hockey and cricket. I will say that outright. It seems football seems to have the worst issue with these problems. I will say this: football seems to have the worst problem when it comes to homophobia, racism, sexism. I think that is a given. But I will say this: football's the most popular sport. You're going to get the most fans going, which means you get a bigger number of people from society going. Bigger cross section, more people going to football matches that weekend than rugby union, rugby league, and ice hockey. They're bigger crowds. It's a bigger sport, which means you're more likely to get idiots. The problem is there is a history and a trend with this kind of problem. And rugby league has had the odd racist incident. When we're not going to deny that. There's been the odd incidents in rugby league at stadiums. It's not on the same level. And when Gareth Thomas, cross-code rugby player, came out as gay, after he came out as gay, he played rugby league for a bit as well. He cross-codes, and he said he was made nothing but welcome. So that was a professional coming out and playing in rugby league and rugby union for a good decade. He was openly gay in the sport, professionally in the sport, and there was no issue with his teammates. There was no issue with fans, the media, nothing. Football seems to have a bigger problem. Football seems to have a much bigger problem, and some of it's to do with the antics and attitudes and behaviour of the players as well, on and off the field. That's something else to consider. What I've seen going to sport and watching, I've been to the horse racing, I've been to cricket, I've been to rugby union, whatever. Lots of live sport as a fan for 23 years of my life. 24 years in December. 24 years I've been going, watching sport as a paying fan. Have I seen fans misbehave? Yes. Have I seen fans get ejected and arrested? Yes. I have seen it happen. Alcohol and sports and large crowds are not a good mix. I will say that. So I've seen some disorder at stadiums. Yeah. Would I say all sports have this? There's going to be idiots who go to every large event and get ejected. There's always that one idiot. You can't hold. I mean, I've seen many at ice hockey. You've had a few too many, and are told they can't drink anymore and get ejected. I've seen a good number get ejected for being drunk and a bit rowdy. Football, it doesn't matter. There seems to be an undercurrent there. A small minority, but the majority are too silent. They're not speaking up enough. They're the ones I think need to be the ones who boycott games. If this issue continues, they need to show positive action in some way. It's all well and good for the players saying it and kick it out, but clearly there's still an issue there. It's still not being resolved. And for some reason, I think football has the worst reputation. Although we are hearing the stories and reports coming about other sports, especially in governance, so away from the fans and away from the playing field, we are hearing issues to do with the running of clubs and governance, and more to do with inclusiveness and sexism coming out. and inappropriate conduct coming out from sports administrators and those working in the back room and the head office kind of side of sport. We've seen a report saying that the FA needs to structurally reform the representation on the board and in all levels of the organisation and employment, saying it's not diverse enough and it's not inclusive enough. And there is some credence to that. The thing is, Chester says it perfectly. If I'm at a football stadium with my daughter and a group of twats, we'll call them twats, I'll shout racist and homophobic abuse. I'm not speaking up to get my head kicked in, and that is a fear a lot of them have. There's a lot of the issue is linked to the hooligan element, which football claimed to have eradicated in the 2000s. Really hadn't. It didn't go away, and there's still an undercurrent there. And we are seeing a rise in arrests at matches. We're seeing a rise in incidents at parades. I mean, look at Liverpool when they won the league. They absolutely, the behaviour there was ridiculous. But then you have to look at the actions of players off the field as well. And you look at what's happened with Harry Maguire in Greece, and there's all sorts going on. Rumours circulation on social media about that. I look at Ben Stokes with his incident with Alex Hales outside that Bristol nightclub. If we are to cut out the issues of poor behaviour, players have to take a lead as well in their own actions. I think when you have players like Jamie Jones Buchanan, who is of a mixed background, I believe he's mixed race, and he's a rugby league legend, and he's also now a TV presenter on Rugby League AM on Free Sports, and I do like watching that. It's a very good program, by the way. The fact that in his 20 plus years of playing in the Super League and Challenge Cup and World Club Challenge and internationally for England, Great Britain, he's stated he's never heard or seen any racism at Headingley or any ground is a testament to rugby league fans. There is a minority. It has happened. There's been one or two incidents of crowd trouble and things said and done. But that is a testament to the sport and how it's worked very, very hard. Because I will tell you now, in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't always like that. It was far more prevalent. So rugby league seems to have, for some reason, and somehow worked out a way to keep the idiots out. And when a player of his standing in the game says, I've not experienced it, and he's a very forthright, honest, and a very articulate man, that tells you something. It tells you that football itself as a sport seems to have an issue, more of an issue. Rugby union, we've barely seen any incidents, have we? Can you think of any? It's more players off the field misbehaving at club and international level, in not just in England, but around the world. Players misbehaving. It's more to do with the drink side of things and occasionally recreational drug misuse. And I think both codes of rugby have done very, very well. Very, very well. And when big name players like Courtney Lawes and Jamie Jones Buchanan in both codes are saying, we haven't experienced, we don't think there's an issue here, that tells you something about the integrity that the sport is played with and the intelligence of the fans. It does show that then football as a microcosm of society has a problem. What could football learn from rugby union? I think football can learn a lot from both codes of rugby, to be fair. The way the players talk to the referees and officials, far more respect given. And in rugby union, rugby league, the refs are fully mic'd up, so a referee can't F them, be abused, because it's in the rule book. Referees are fully mic'd up, so the stadium and the TV audience can hear. And when a player goes off on one, I saw this in the Sydney Roosters Brisbane Broncos game last week. Jared Rewera-Hargreaves really got in the ref's face. Didn't swear at him, but the referee said, "Don't talk to me like that again, or you will go take 10 minutes." And a Brisbane player did drop a knee on a Roosters player back of his neck. It was instant foul play, and it was put on report. It was the way Rewera-Hargreaves reacted, and it was demanding the referee look at the incident, but he's not the captain. The fact that the captain was the one on the ground completely flawed is interesting. But yes, Jake Friend, the Roosters captain, was concussed. He was knocked out. And in the instant where he was knocked out, was involved in the tackle with Ria Hargreaves, and they're tackling a Brisbane player. The Brisbane player is then the player who drops the knee on the back of his head. It's dirty play. It's a cheap shot. The way he reacted, the referee said, "Don't reproach me like that." Again, I can understand your passion, but the way the referee and the player spoke to each other, you could understand why the player was, um, you know, aggrieved. But the referee's fully mic'd up. The player realises the referee's fully mic'd up. He suddenly calls his tone at half time as the players are going off. He apologises straight up to the referee. It won't happen again. I think football, they crowd around the referee. The referee gets called all sorts. And with the fans not being in stadiums, you can pick up a lot more. So now they're having to put a delayed feed on the live feeds that we see on Sky, BT, free to wear, internet streams. There's now a delayed feed of 15 to 30 seconds, so they can sort of try and turn the microphones down and edit out the abuse. I think if the VAR system is to work correctly, referees need to be fully marked up. That would very quickly, because they have in the rule book, abuse of an official, that's a booking. Very rarely do the referees book players for dissent and abuse of officials. Dissent they book occasionally, but abuse of officials, they're not booking them enough. Players need to be held accountable for their actions, because this is, I think, a cultural thing with football. The referees don't take action when they're the ones taking the verbal abuse from players. We have seen players suspended for physical altercations with officials. I mean, I remember Paolo Di Canio, when he pushed the referee over when he was playing for Sheffield Wednesday, he got a lengthy ban for that. But unfortunately, the referees are very reluctant to book players for the abuse they receive. And it's in the rule book, they have to. And they don't enforce it. I think they need to be tougher on the players, crowding around them, demanding other players be booked. And yeah, the simulation and the faking of injuries is also pathetic. Again, it's in the rule book that if you're feigning injury, you're bringing the game into disrepute. You should be booked. And occasionally we do see players get booked for diving, but nowhere near on the level they should be. And that again irks me. Because if in rugby union, rugby league, ice hockey, you're pretending to be hurt, you also get a penalty against, especially in ice hockey, it's a 2-minute penalty for not simulation, what's the embellishment. You're pretending to be more hurt than you actually are. You get a 2-minute penalty for embellishment. And even though you've won the penalty, so you're meant to be on the power play, you're off in the box as well. And I've seen referees give 2 minutes to a player for over exaggerating a fall. It's in the rule book, and it is enforced. I think that would do something to, coaches have been ejected from games for really going at it with the officials, especially in ice hockey. That happens regularly. Football, that happens occasionally as well. And yeah, if you could turn down the fake fan noise, depending on your stream you're watching, and you listen, oh my God, the Europa League final, Conte was going nuts at the ref. He absolutely was giving him a torrent of abuse in the first half, absolute torrent. And he did get a yellow card for that. He was told, if you carry on doing this, you're going to the dressing room. You're up in the stand. You cannot continue. I think they need to do it more often. I think the officials need to be bolder and actually stamp it out. And the authorities like the FA or UEFA or FIFA, depending on the governing body that's sanctioning the event, be it a league game, European Cup game, championship game when it comes to internationals, they need to give the referees the authority and really encourage referees to go right from the get-go, from the first whistle, lay out the law, start booking players. Because they will very quickly, when they're getting a 2-3 game suspension for a red card or accumulating too many bookings, that's going to hurt their team. That's going to hurt their team going forward. And coaches will be like, you're now suspended for 3 games because you've got a red card. Or you're going to miss a game because you've got too many yellows. And that will suddenly change players' behaviour. But it's an ingrained behaviour from when they're very, very young. Coaches will actually tell players to pressurise referees into giving them decisions. It does not help when you have coaches abusing the officials from the sidelines. I mean, look at Neil Warnock, some of the stuff with him on social media, especially on YouTube, some of the clips of Neil Warnock blowing up in his early days as a manager, and some of the borderline, bringing the game into distribute, comments he's making from the touchline. That happens every match. Oh yeah, rugby. Both kinds of rugby, the AFL as well, and cricket. There's a good rapport between the players and the officials, the match officials. There's a very good working relationship because the umpires, the referees will go into the dressing rooms before a match for both sides and have a captain's meeting. They'll talk to both sets of captains before a game and both sets of coaches and say, look, and they will actually, have that captain's meeting, especially in rugby union, and they will also have meetings with like especially to do with scrums and set plays and safety issues, and they will say, we've discussed things in the training room. You'll hear that in rugby union, rugby league matches about what we've discussed before or whatever, and they have much more respect than I think the football officials. They get a lot more abuse. And there's a reason why we're seeing less referees in the game, especially at amateur level. There's a shortage. There's not enough, that transcends then to the stands. There is a link. I believe there's a link personally, because you look at the fan bases of rugby and cricket and ice hockey. It's the same type of fan base as you get in football. You've got people across the generations, across backgrounds, sexualities. Gay, straight, black, white, pink, purple hair. Sports fans are sports fans. But then there's a difference. You look how the sports, the teams, the players, how they behave, how they interact with the officials, how they present themselves in interviews, their off-field antics, and then you look at football. And there is a massive difference. These rugby union, rugby league players, ice hockey players, cricket players are paid a hell of a lot less than football players. And ironically, all those sports are more dangerous. Cricket, we've seen players die at the crease with cricket balls to the head. Rugby league, rugby union, we've seen players paralysed. Ice hockey, we've seen players paralysed. They're not paid as nowhere near as much as football players. And some of the long-term injuries these guys suffer, and their careers are generally shorter as well. I mean, some of the players are play on with like broken bones. They play when they're all strapped up. I mean, some of the injuries they sustain make you shudder. They're not paid enough. On the side of football, you could argue they're overpaid at the top level, which I think is correct. I think there have been the odd incidents in cricket where Jofra Archer was given some not very nice abuse, and Ben Stokes. But I think difference between Archer and Stokes in certain aspects is Ben Stokes has always been a controversial character off the field as well. And I've been critical of some of Stokes' behaviour off the field and what he's got involved in, be it on social media, in public with his wife, or in what happened in Bristol. There's a lot of controversy still around that incident, and he does divide opinion. Jofra Archer, it is complicated because he was fast-tracking in the system. Should he be playing for the West Indies? Should he be playing for Bermuda? Should he play for him? We have to look at selection rules. Jofra Archer as a player, he was brilliant bowling today. He's been brilliant in this one-day series. He's a very, very valuable asset for England in all formats of the game. He's a great young talented player. He should not have received that abuse down under. It's a thing. He should not have received that. On the Ben Stokes thing, unfortunately, his dad's now passed away, which is sad. But Ben Stokes, while I don't think he's justified, some of his antics off the field don't help his case to be beloved. Is he a brilliant cricketer? Absolutely. Is he also a giant arsehole? Absolutely. He doesn't help himself with some of his antics off the field throughout his career. He does divide opinion. And you could look at some of the selection rules and should he play for England, should he play for New Zealand, all that BS. At the moment, he's an England cricketer. He's playing for England. He's part of England's setup. The issue is, I think Ben Stokes has got damage to his reputation and his criticism of him for what he does off the field, and it is justified. And you can't hide away from the fact that he has gone to court for fighting in the street. There are still murky. I mean, some of the court case was a bit embarrassing. Had he been charged with GBH or ABH, he's going to prison. It's easier to prove than a fray. He was lucky that it was the charge of a fray, which is harder to prove in a court of law and has a lower conviction rate. Had he been charged with GBH or ABH, he's getting time in prison and his cricket career is possibly done. So in that respect, I think he's lucky. There are still concerns about the fact that England players in the middle of a cricketing series, so they're actually on international duty against the West Indies, were out after curfew, and or if there was a curfew, and how the fact they got themselves in that situation. That's concerning. And should they got themselves in a position? No. Do I believe that they are human beings? Yes. But at the same time, a lot of them are badly advised and badly behaved themselves. And Alex Hales has also, had his own off-field issues with drug issues and alcohol problems, and he was also involved in that incident. And you can go back to the Pedlo incident with Flintoff and Anderson in the Cricket World Cup 2007, and see there's a long-term trend here with cricket. Same thing with Australia, same thing with South Africa and New Zealand. Off-field antics with players has been going on in cricket and rugby union, rugby league for a long time. Same as football. And there is an undercurrent of drink and recreational drug misuse within all these sports. And unfortunately, it's there. Who would I pick in my England T20 11? I don't watch as much cricket as I used to, but I am very, very keen on Josh Buttler as the wicketkeeper and as an upper order attacking batsman. The thing is, T20 with the IPL, we have to look at the cricketing calendar, and the 100 format doesn't help T20 in this country whatsoever. And really, the existing fan base is already divided about Tests, ODIs, T20s, the formats. There's the conservative side of cricket, and there's the more progressive side of cricket. I lean more towards the progressive side of cricket, but I think the 100 is the wrong way to go about it. The best way to go about increasing participation is really getting free-to-air coverage again of domestic cricket in this country, be it international or county. I think there is issues there on the Jofra Archer situation. I think it's not his fault of the eligibility rules. It's not. But he could have also played for the West Indies. He could also play for Bermuda. Bermuda obviously don't have a Test side. He wanted to play Test cricket. He had two options, and he chose England. The ECB were also very, very keen to get his signature on a centralised contract. The West Indies can't offer as much money at Test level. He wants to play Test cricket and prove himself as a Test player. It still divides opinion. I mean, look, Kevin Peterson played for England. He was South African, but he burned his bridges with the South African selectors and the South African governing body of the Proteas with some of his antics. And I don't know if they bent the rules. I'm not overly. I know that he obviously had his. They tried to fast track it, I believe, but they were very keen to get him to play in the World Cup last year. Otherwise, I think it would have been this year. So there would have been, I think, some loophole in the rules they exploited. But either way, Jofra Archer, it doesn't matter if he plays for England or West Indies. He's a brilliant player, and I would happily watch him play in the IPL. I would happily watch him play for the West Indies. It doesn't bother me because he's still playing Test cricket. He's still playing one-day cricket. He's still playing T20. And he's still developing his game. And England have not had a bowler who can bowl that fast ever. So, yeah, he's one of the fastest bowlers of all time on his peak, on his faster ball. I think Wood can bowl pretty fast, but I think Jofra Archer is one of those few who can consistently bowl over 95 mile an hour, which is rare enough. And to bowl consistently over 80 mile an hour as a fast-paced bowler for a whole sesh is insane. And he can bowl fast. and very few fast bowlers can bowl consistently at the same pace. Some of them have to drop in a slow ball, or they get slower over their stint. He can keep up that intensity because he's young. He's the fastest bowler we've got. I think Wood can match him for short spells, but I think Archer has a little bit more in his armoury when it comes to maintaining the pace of his bowling. Thoughts on the controversial double penalties in the last minutes against Ireland? I didn't watch the game. Carl Walker getting sent off, however, that makes me chuckle. The fact he even got selected for the squad makes me chuckle because he's not really an integral part of Manchester City, and to be fair, he's a liability. And considering, I think with the penalties against Iceland, well, not watching the game, I can't really comment, obviously, without having to see it for myself. But I'm not a big fan of the Nations League format anyway. I think it adds even more congestion to the international calendar. I know the reason why the Nations League came about was there was a frustration with how the friendlies worked and how watching them wasn't great quality football. But England Iceland has become a bit of a fiery rivalry in recent years, wouldn't you say? Since Euro 2016, it's become a very interesting little rivalry, and I actually kind of enjoy it. I think more can be said about why Carl Walker was selected for the squad, and there are people are actually labelling a lot of criticism at Southgate for some of his squad selections. Why is Jamie Vardy not an international player anymore, and why was more not done to keep him in the international setup for longer as one of the senior elder players, because he is a winner. You could talk about the use of VAR not being there, and it's also not been there for the Euro qualifiers as well. If you pay attention as well, the Euro qualifiers it wasn't used. So obviously there's concerns about VAR, and UEFA clearly aren't happy with it. I think the debate about VAR is involved in this. But as I say, I didn't watch the game, so I'm not obviously going to comment on an instance that I haven't seen. But I'm not a big fan of the Nations League. I think some people are on board with it. I think that the lack of free-to-air viewing is not right. It's international football. It should be accessible. Every other international tournament, friendlies, qualifiers, and the main tournaments are free-to-air. So, there's a question mark there about to get more people on side and more people buying into the format. Have it more readily available, please. The lack of VAR being used in internationals. There is issues with the VAR setup. And yeah, not all the countries do have the facilities for video VAR, but you would think UEFA and FIFA, having so much money sloshing around, they can finance it. But the way it's been implemented in the domestic leagues has been a mess. Different leagues are using it in a different way. There's no universal system. It's not being used for Euro qualifiers, but it's being used in the tournament. That's a head scratcher because teams can qualify without having to use it. And then it gets used at an international tournament. Makes no sense. Personally, stadiums have to meet UEFA standard to have international and Champions League and Europa League games. So when they use VAR, I don't know. I have concerns about how VAR has been implemented since the World Cup in 2018. I think that's the best it's ever been used. I think we had a good starting point in 2018. I think we've taken a backward step. The way it's been implemented in England has been nothing short of farcical, and fans are losing faith in the system, even though it's here to stay. I think fans are losing faith in the system. It is what it is. Opinions on the Manchester City avoiding the UEFA ban. Well, a precedent's been set with PSG and AC Milan as well. AC Milan got their ban reduced. PSG got a similar fine. Man City get their ban overturned and a fine that they're only going to earn back in 7 minutes. It's not a good look, but UEFA have come out and Serafin's come out and said the system is broken anyway, it doesn't work effectively. And the guy who's actually English, by the way, who came up with the financial fair play rules, said the system's flawed. We need a better system. And what a better time to argue for salary caps or spending caps than the current financial climate that we find ourselves in. I cannot see a transfer of the same level as Neymar's taking place in the next 5 to 10 years. I think even Mbappe's transfer, and Maguire's transfer, I think is as high as I think transfers will get at any point in the next 12 months. You know, I think it makes a mockery of the fact that now any team can go, well, they got a reduced ban, sod it, we'll just break the rules as well. Football governance is a mess. It's not transparent enough. When an organisation comes out and says the system we have in place is broken, but they cannot come up with an alternative, shows weak governance anyway. The fact that individual leagues are saying we need a salary cap or a spending cap that's rigorously enforced and can keep teams going tells you there's a problem with the system. The fact that sports with less money have worked out effective salary cap systems, effective punishments for teams who break salary cap. Look at rugby union, look at the NHL, look at the NFL, look at the NRL, look at the Super League. Teams have been punished and they've not appealed those bans successfully, or those punishments successfully. It gives an incentive for other teams not to follow the system that's in place because they know that their ban will be reduced or overturned on appeal. But I've said for a long time that the sustainability of football is finite. And this coronavirus pandemic has highlighted all the issues with governance, poor financial management, reckless overspending, poor regulation and governance when it comes to ownership, lack of transparency in the system. It's highlighted how overpaid players are, how overinflated the transfer market really is. Ticket prices for what they are, the subscription fee that you have to pay, and how fans have started to switch off. BT and Sky are hemorrhaging money right now. On a level, and the TV deals know how they're structured. And when lower league teams are saying we could go out of business, we need a salary cap, tells the system doesn't work. And the situation with Macclesfield that was carrying on before the coronavirus, Bury going out of business before the coronavirus. And you could say the Bulldogs in 2002, and you could say the Melbourne Storm, or the Parramatta Eels, or the Manly Sea Eagles, or Cronulla. They all had various punishments implemented, and none of them were successful in appealing those punishments. The Wigan Warriors got punished for breaching a salary cap. Saracens, look what's happened to them. They're basically relegated. They didn't have their title stripped away. So other sports have dealt with salary cap breaches and have enforced either soft or hard caps or flexi caps that work very effectively. And when teams get caught out, they are rightly punished. And guess what? In a salary cap system, no team has been fully successful in fully overturning a ban or a fine or a punishment. Plain and simple. And the Bulldogs 2002, I think, is not the worst case. I think Melbourne Storm is the worst case of systemic salary cap breaches. But the Bulldogs one is just as serious. It's further down in the memory. 18 years ago, but I think it still highlights the issue of integrity and enforcing. Football could learn a lot. Football could learn. Just look at the NRL. They were the first league to restart. They were the first league to get fans back in stadiums. They negotiated pretty good TV media deal that's pretty much equals to the one they have now. Players, not all players have had to have salary reductions, although there are roster size restrictions. There are going to be 2 less players on a team's roster for next season. Some players have had to take some reduced wages, but overall the salary cap is not getting cut, it's just staying flat. And players have been more willing to take salary cuts and deferrals. Football, it was a mess. Owen Farrell's high tackle. Well, he's been brought up on his tackling technique before, and even in rugby league, that is still 10 minutes in the bin. he's still getting sent off in rugby league for that. He's been questioned about his basic shoulder charge. I mean, the shoulder charge has been outlawed in rugby league for a good decade now, and some fans don't like that. They want to see it back. But his tackling technique's been highlighted before. He's fallen foul of referees and given away penalties and been sin-binned before and cited before for his tackle technique. It is a cheap shot, plain and simple. A lot of people debating it. He's become a social media meme yet again. He's not a very well-liked player. He's a very good player, but he keeps doing this, and his technique hasn't changed. He's got away with a fair few nasty, no arms, shoulder to the head tackles before in internationals and club games where the referee hasn't picked it up. It has been missed by the officials. Then the replays show that has he wrapped his arms? Where's the initial contact? Has he ridden high? So he doesn't help himself. Is he a dirty player? That's another question. He keeps doing this though. And yes, he comes from his dad. Obviously, his dad Andy Farrell was a rugby league legend. And yes, his dad also played union, but his dad is a coach. But he grew up watching his dad playing league. But he grew up playing union. But he comes from a rugby league background. Even now, even so, that tackle is still a high tackle in rugby league. He has a shocking tackling technique, and other players do get hurt. So is he a dirty player? Well, let's leave that debate open. We know other players have a poor tackling technique. These themselves getting injured. Lee Halfpenny has a shocking tackle technique. Gets his head in the wrong position all the time. Gets knocked out, concussed a lot. Tackle technique is shocking. Kids watch this, and when they bring in these rule changes, it's not because the kids can't tackle when they're taught at school between the ages of 11 and 16. It's because the senior pros have a shocking tackle technique because they're going to the big hit all the time. If his shoulder's lower and his body position is lower, it's not a high tackle. But he does this a lot, and it's something that has been in his game from day one. Is he oversteps the mark more often than he should? I know he's a prickly character and he winds up opposition players, and that's great. You need that kind of grit in your team where you have that agitating player who's also exceptionally physical to stand up for himself. The problem is his tackle technique, and it's repeat dirty tackles or dangerous tackles or high tackles. It's a constant thing with him, whether it's reckless, dirty, bad technique, just bad technique. I don't know. But here's the thing. He's been doing this constantly throughout his career. This is not a new thing. This is not something he's just gone, oh, well, I'm just going to put a shoulder through his head or a high arm. This is a regular thing every season. 3 or 4 games a season, there'll be that debate about Owen Farrell and dirty play. And this is not just winding up players at breakdowns and at breaks and play where he's given a bit of lip and he's a bit of push and shove and winding up the opposition in the tunnel. No, this is on the field, dirty. He's going to get that reputation as a grub, as the Australians would say. He's going to get that reputation as a dirty player, which is going to stick with him. And he's a brilliant goal kicker. He's a brilliant, fly half inside centre. But if it's reckless, it's consistently reckless. If it's dirty, it's consistently dirty. I think it's a mix of the two. But I've never actually met Owen Farrell. I've met a lot of rugby and football and rugby league players and hockey players and all that, and you get a kind of a feel for what they're like on and off the field from the way they present themselves. He is a very prickly character. He has that spice, in his game. But the constant, what I call dirty play, whether it's reckless or generally grub behaviour, as I call it, cheap shot behaviour, I think it's a bit of both. He regularly oversteps the mark. He has been yellow carded before. He has been sent off before at all levels. He keeps doing it. I think whether he's been told to get physical by his coaches at Saracens and keep doing it and keep crossing that line, I don't know. But I think I have concerns that going forward it's going to continue in his game. And when you get on the wrong side of the officials when it comes to the sighting commission, you get longer bans. And it's only going to hurt his team. And we know Saracens are getting relegated at the end of the season. But going forward, it happens for England as well. We've seen multiple dirty challenges from him in an England shirt. We've seen it in a Saracens jersey as well. It's in his game. So I don't know if you can say he's dirty, outright dirty, or it's just reckless. I think it's a bit of the two. When are fans going to be back in sports? Well, we know that a few events such as snooker World Championships and Brighton have played, I think, a trial game with fans in attendance, pre-season friendly. The Scottish government are saying the 14th, which is next week, this time next week, for fans to be allowed back in. The UK government is saying the 1st of October, which is 2 weeks later, which is 3 weeks away. The French government said sometime in September. Now, obviously, the Tour de France is taking place right now, and there are concerns that that may not actually get completed with the coronavirus. We're waiting here on Team Ineos if their tests, anyone comes back, with a positive test result. It'll be interesting to see what happens if a rider tests positive. And Thibaut Pinot is a prime example of a rider really struggling right now. He looks like he's not 100%. Fabien Aru, one of the a really good rider, solid domestique, if you call it that, solid GC rider, pulling out day, drop time from flag drop all the way. He abandoned halfway through the stage. So I don't know. We're given provisional dates right now. We've seen a few trial events, including the snooker, which was highlighted as a trial event before they, stopped them going to the Crucible. They were allowed back in for the final. It's a wait and see if these provisional dates become permanent dates, but we don't know what's going to happen. But a lot of sports are heavily reliant on fans and attendance. This is why the Elite League hasn't given a restart date. This is why lower leagues are really concerned about, in football and rugby league, and rugby, are concerned about their finances and teams being able to survive. And if a cricket match is cancelled during a break in the session, during the lunch break, that tells you that I don't think we're ready for fans just yet. Unless you put these sports stars during season into a bubble. And we've seen how difficult that is with players leaving the bubble for family reasons and then having to re-quarantine and then come back and quarantine again. I don't know how it's going forward. What's going to happen? It's an interesting question. But these are provisional dates for allowing bigger public gatherings. There's some trial events in Germany to do with indoor music and stand-up comedy and cinemas and indoor arenas, trialing and doing experiments to see how quickly people can get infected. They're doing some weird science experiments with about, I think, 5,000 people signed up for an experiment where they're looking at what happens in an enclosed space. I don't know how they're doing it, but there are things going on. The mental health impacts, that's been discussed on a lot of, especially in North America, where there's a lot of bubble type thing. We look at the New Zealand Warriors as well. Players left their team camp in Australia and went back to New Zealand and weren't allowed to resume playing with the team until next season. And they're away from their families for 5-6 months with this resumption. And there are concerns about how they're going to feel. Same with Toronto Wolfpack as well. They couldn't resume playing in the Super League. So we've seen it in Scottish football with Aberdeen, St Johnstone, with the game getting postponed because 3 players tested positive. We've seen it in the German second-tier Bundesliga with Cologne having players test positive. The team sports especially have to mitigate this with, they've had to get rid of the winter break in football. They've got rid of replays in the FA Cup and League Cup to mitigate the risk, which actually ironically helps with fixture congestion. The NRL has a shortened season from the restart, state of origin and bye weeks. State of origin's been moved to our postseason. Bye weeks have been eliminated for the rest of this season. They've shortened the season, I think, 7 rounds. So there is some mitigation and it allows some leeway, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this upcoming football season. What happens with rugby league, with the Challenge Cup and the rest of the Super League, and the resumption of the Championship and League One for next season. Then we've got all the big sporting events next year. There's debates about the point of replays post the 3rd round in the FA Cup. They've been slowly cutting them back season upon season. We used to have the FA Cup final as a replay as well back in the day. Semi-finals, no replays anymore. Quarterfinals, no replays anymore. Anyway, I think fifth. I think the fourth, though, we're doing replays up to the fourth round this last season. I think they've got rid of them for this season temporarily. Whether that stays long term, we'll see. League Cup, they're looking at restructuring that. The whole thing, we need to look at, fixture congestion is a thing. Jacob Umunga for England or Marcus Smith is only about October games. There are other good fly halves out there, but we're not even sure if these October games are going to take place yet because we've seen Japan pull out of this Eight Nations tournament. And is Georgia going to, get a place in there and replace them? Will the games actually go ahead? They've got to finish the Six Nations as well and finish off that tournament. Lots of question marks about International Rugby Union in the next 6 to 12 months. And Rugby League as well, because the Rugby League World Cup, we're talking about the Olympics and Paralympics should have taken place this summer. Euro 2020 should have taken place this summer. The World Championship of Ice Hockey should have taken place, Wimbledon. And obviously all these events will be pushed back. And will the World Championship of Ice Hockey take place? Will the Euro 2020 take place? The Olympics? These questions are still not answered. We're still not getting answered by the organisers. Will they actually definitely take place? UEFA are already saying they're never going to do a pan-continental, pan-continental Euro 2020 kind of format. UEFA said we're never doing a cross-continent format ever again. It's going to be a host nation or host nations going forward. They realised very quickly, even though it was to honour the 60th anniversary of playing the first Euros, they realised very, very quickly that this is going to prove logistically a nightmare. Different time zones, different currencies, different cultures, different laws governing public gatherings, drinking in public, a whole host of things. So there's that concern. We'll see what happens. The Olympics is the big one because the Japanese government's put so much money into the infrastructure projects linked to the Olympics that it's a key government policy of the Abe government. Abe's now stood down, but it's a key government domestic policy and international policy of Japan. And there is a concern that it may not take place, and there's a lot of contracts and money on the line there from sponsors. So we'll see what happens with the Olympics. Because not all the qualifying events have taken place yet, so we'll see what happens. We shall see what happens with the Olympics. There are still concerns that it may not take place next summer. The Springboks, there's been rumours that it might be Georgia entering as Eight Nations, South Africa. Rugby hasn't resumed in South Africa. And a lot of the players are based, obviously, in the South African teams. The Cheetahs and the Southern Kings aren't resuming play in the Pro 14. And no rugby is taking place in South Africa right now at club level. So, and there was no Super Rugby tournament like Australia and New Zealand. So the issue with the South Africans joining is none of these South African players, apart from those based in Europe who are eligible to play for South Africa, are eligible because they haven't played. So the risk of injury is higher, the risk of fitness not being up to standard. You won't get the best. I mean, you could say, oh great, the Springboks very defensive. They won a World Cup. They decisively beat England in the World Cup final. They won a World Cup. They pushed the All Blacks all the way. And are one of the few teams that I think on their day can beat the All Blacks decisively. And yeah, they play a very defensive style of rugby, but they're playing to what the rules allow them to play. And they adapt their game very, very, very well. So you can criticise the All Blacks, not the Springboks all you want, but look how many World Cups they've won. They've won 3 World Cups. So you can criticise them all they want. They're the second most successful team in World Cup rugby after the All Blacks. There's a reason why. They are an absolute machine when it comes to international rugby union. They figure out a way to win. And if that means they've got to be gritty, defensive, and in your face, and gnarly, and more bish bash bosh out of the middle rather than flowing backline moves, so be it. There's a reason why the All Blacks didn't retain their title. They just did not adapt their game in 2019. and they didn't have that same team unity that um, other teams had. I like the way the Japanese play. Um, More expansive. They use their weaknesses as strengths, ironically, especially on the scrum. They're very quick at scrum time. They don't have as many reset scrums as other nations when they have the ball. They use their weaknesses as strengths, ironically. So they are a lighter weight pack. They're a more mobile pack, and the speed they play the game, the speed they rock and maul is really breathtaking because it opens up the game more. Um, and yeah, they got to their first knockout stage game, and okay, they were outdone in that game tactically, but their group stage games were brilliant. The pace they play the ball, and the structures they have in place, they play at a far high energy, fast pace, and a lot of teams, bigger to bulkier teams, can't live with that. So there are plans to open up the game more. Suits Japan, suits those teams that have more mobile, fast paced, still big players. These are still huge units of men, but I think um, they're more mobile. They play at a higher pace, and I think playing at a higher intensity and pace can be the difference. And South Africa, there's a reason why they won the World Cup because they defended with intensity, they defended with physicality, and the way that they had used their big men more effectively against teams that were willing to ruck because they worked out how to slow down the quicker rucking teams legally and illegally and frustrate them and then make them do more defending. So if you have to go through 20 or 30 phases, one up ball running, so be it, to wear down defence, and then you open up a little bit. Would you rather watch Liverpool or Atletico Madrid play football? Personally, I like the 4-3-3 kind of counter-attack dynamic. If both sides play a 4-3-3 counter-attack dynamic, it actually means end-to-end football. Would I rather watch Liverpool or Atletico Madrid do that? I don't care what team plays um, that format. I honestly don't. I prefer open end-to-end football. I prefer watching lots of goals, very open, attack-minded football. I think that's the joy of watching the game. If you watch Brazil in 1970 and the Dutch sides of the 70s, even though they came up short in international tournaments, that was the joy of it. Um, the South American teams in general, that was the joy of their football. It was spontaneity, and defending was not necessarily as competent as some of the more 1-0 up, part the bus kind of mentality of some of the European teams. But I think, I like very open football. At the same time, when you have very open, entertaining football, you don't necessarily win games. You might win hearts and minds because you're playing in the right kind of mentality, but you don't necessarily win games in tournaments. That's where the Dutch, especially in 74 and 78, came up short because they couldn't defend as well. And they didn't quite have that mentality of getting over the line and winning a tournament. Whereas the Argentinians gets that win in 78 because they were a little bit more defensively structured. But even so, it's amazing to watch a free-flowing game when it's end-to-end and you can have some really entertaining games. And as a neutral, that's what you want to watch. As a neutral, that's what you want to watch when you have no horse in the race, just watching really open end-to-end. I don't like parking the bus mentality. I like counter-attacking where you turn the ball over and you've got some quick players to exploit the space, exploit tired players and defensive mismatches. I like that in rugby league. I like it in rugby union. I like it in ice hockey. I like it in football. Open end-to-end games. That's for me what is most entertaining. I've seen some of the most entertaining NRL games in the last 3-4 since the rule changes with the 6 again rule and the one referee on the pitch and the set restart rule. I'm really enjoying how the game has opened up and liberalised the rules a little bit, increased the speed of the game, increased the speed and the openness and more entertaining. I think the rules still need a bit of tweaking, but more entertaining. So the Springboks do raise their game when it comes to the big games. They do have a winning mentality. It's religion in South Africa. It's like AFL and rugby league in Australia. It's religious. It's rugby union in New Zealand, in fact, both kinds of rugby in New Zealand, it's ingrained in their education system. It's ingrained in their university system. It's ingrained in the amateur system. It's there. And yeah, South Africa, I think they're one of the more adaptable rugby union nations when it comes to international rugby about how they play. And yeah, they can be a little bit stale at times and a bit defensively minded, but it wins them World Cups and it wins them tour series and it wins them games. Doesn't have, you have to win heart and minds. But when you got Faf de Klerk at scrum half, who's a small man who doesn't mind taking on the big men and actually taking out the big man and ball tackles, that's kind of entertaining. I think the Springboks, I think, is the most pragmatic team. I think you look at how they've won each of their World Cups, and yeah, they are a machine. And when they're playing the South African way, which is a pragmatic, physical style, there's a bit of dirtiness in there, there's a bit of needle in there. Yeah, they play well. When they've got a team unity, they play well. When they have a purpose, they play well. When they're not playing so well and they don't reach World Cup finals, it's because there's a disunity in the team. They're not pragmatic enough. They're trying to go with plan A, no plan B. There's too much ill discipline or not enough gnarliness in the team. So South Africa, it's a hit and miss with them. They either win a World Cup final because they've never lost a World Cup final, or they win them if they get to the World Cup final. They have a very good record when it gets to finals. They win World Cup finals, but if they don't get there, they've never not got out of the group stage. That's something I will reiterate. They are continually get to the knockout stages, and their sevens program is improved. And their sevens program, you have to watch them. They are very exciting playing sevens, and that's starting to transcend a little bit more with some of their smaller outside backs who are more fleet of foot and more pace. You are seeing over the last decade some really pacey, skillful outside backs playing the game for them. So I like their physical style of play. I like how I don't mind how the Springboks play. I do like some of how they play some of their tactics. I'm not overly keen on how they play all the time, but they're a very pragmatic team. I think that's what's been missed in this discussion is their pragmatism and their way that they are always going to give you a physical battle. So you have to be on your physical top game. You can't have a player who's 75% fit, 80% fit, trying to play the South Africans. You will be smashed. And to say South Africa are the only national program that's got players doping is a lie. You just have to look at some of the All Blacks, some of the Australians. Some of the Australians have been caught. Some of the English players. It's not just South Africans. There is a doping issue across rugby union. It's not just South Africans. We've seen rugby league players get caught for doping. I don't think it's institutionalised as much as people think. I think it's more down to the individual player. But there's definitely a doping issue. There's also a recreational drug issue in both codes of rugby. Alcohol problems is there, but it's not as widespread as in athletics and cycling. Let's be clear on that. Rugby league players have been caught out at an individual level, and both recreational drug misuse and individual steroid and such things. We've seen Sheary, the Cronulla Sharks centre, he's facing 4-year ban. He's been systemically doping since he was at youth level. That's not on the club, that's on him. Even though Cronulla had their issues with the peptide scandal a few years back, that is on Sherry, the Cronulla Sharks player. There was a Brisbane Broncos player in the last season who got caught doping as well. They're both there. The fact that there's doping there, and yeah, South Africa's been exposed. It doesn't mean they're the only system or the only country doing it. Look at the US Olympic programs at colleges. There's systemic doping there. Systemic. Look at the East German Olympic program back in the 70s and 80s. Systemic. The Russian program, systemic. It's not just South Africa and rugby. It's a thing that's happening in Olympic and professional sport, be it on an individual basis or a club system. The peptide scandal and the AFL and NRL involved whole clubs systemically giving their players banned substances. It really sent shockwaves through Australian sport. It's a thing. It's a social. It is an issue. It's not as widespread as I think it's being led to believe. I've seen when I was at boarding school, I saw kids doping. I know kids who are my age at school were doping. I know kids in my cousin's year at his school were doping. The fact that 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds were trying to bulk up, get big, was worrying to me when I was 18, 19, hearing my cousin talk about how his coaches were asking other players, some of the kids to bulk up. These kids may not necessarily go on to play rugby professionally, and I think very few of them did. There was a couple of lads in my year who went on play rugby professionally, but again, there was a kid in the year below who was at Harlequins Academy, my school. A mate of mine plays for Bath now. He's played for London Irish, and they were actively encouraged to bulk up. And they're not guaranteed to want to carry it on post university because there's university rugby, and B, they're not necessarily going to be good enough when they get to senior level, and your career can be dead short. And they were encouraged to bulk up, and that says to me, and there were kids who were actively taking steroids while I was at school. I know that for a fact. There were kids actually taking steroids, whether that was with their parents' consent or not, or with the school's knowledge or not. It wouldn't surprise me if the school did have knowledge, but the coaches were actively telling kids at 14, 15, 16, up to the age of 18 to bulk up, get big. And you're not guaranteed to make it at that age. And just because you're good at youth level doesn't mean it's going to transcend to senior level. You might be completely out of your depth with that transitioning style of play. Completely out of your depth. One injury and you're done. And the fact that we have seen rugby league, rugby union players at professional level being known to have doped when they're at school and junior grades, it happens. And so it wouldn't surprise me if, over here, they are knowingly giving their kids roids. Wouldn't surprise me at all. Whether it's as widespread as it isn't. So, there is an issue in South Africa. It's not. Rugby union is a way to get out of poverty because it's one of the biggest sport over there, and B, it's a very competitive sport to get into. If your kid's really good, it's a social status thing. We know in the US, collegiate athletes are doping, and their families are fully aware of it and are actively participating in it. Doping cycling, that goes back to the late 60s, if not earlier. Amphetamines was the first major issue in pro cycling in the 60s. The 70s and 80s and the 90s is where it was out of control. And then the Lance Armstrong saga. The Festina scandal in 98, I think, was the beginning of the end of systemic doping in cycling. It still is an issue. The sport still has rumours about it actually happening. Pro cyclists are still getting caught doping as well, so it's not completely gone away. But it is interesting when interviews are given with cyclists like who have doped in the past and what's happening now. David Miller, he now works for ITV as a commentator. He wore the yellow jersey at points in his career. Never actually won the tour. Retired a few years ago. Caught doping in his 20s. Got a ban, rightfully so. He now advocates for anti-doping policies. He admits that he did wrong, but he said 80 to 85% of the peloton when he was riding in the late 90s, early 2000s at his peak were doping. He now talks to cyclists regularly on an anonymous basis. And he's saying, and a lot of other reports are saying, that percentage now he's saying now that around 25% of the peloton is probably doping, if not less. So there has been a shift in cycling. There's still an issue there. It's nowhere near as systemic as it was 20 years ago. And I think the Lance Armstrong scandal has really damaged public confidence in the sport. And the athletes themselves are looking at, you look at Alberto Contador and what's happened with him. And you look at rumours circulating around Team Sky during the Froome and Wiggins years at their peak. They're not going away. So the public perception has been dented, and the allegations from the 60s to the 90s were there, and riders were getting individually caught. But when the Festina scandal happened in '98, that in itself, I think, was the beginning of the end of systemic team doping, because then we found out what happened with Lance Armstrong and the teams he cycled for, and the sponsors, and US Postal and all that. And that's had a massive impact. Floyd Landis as well, Contador twice, Vinokourov has been caught. It was interesting when Lance Armstrong was getting away with it. His key rivals were getting caught. So yeah, the ICI and the other tour organisers have to look at themselves and go, right, if we're completely serious about that's a bloody bug on my floor, which I've just squished quite nicely. That is very nice and dead. Yeah. And yeah, the public perception was severely damaged, and the reaction from the public was very, visceral. And the French love their pro cycling. It's a religion over in France. The Italians and the Spanish also, because they're also Grand Tour countries with the Vuelta and the Giro, were very visceral. And when Marco Pantini, the pirate, passed away very, very young, not that long ago, actually, that raised the question over the integrity of the sport and why was doping basically being tolerated on such a level. And yeah, pro cycling's done a lot to clean up its act, and it's less of an issue now. It's still a massive issue. It's less of. And the unfortunate thing is, it still has a long way to go. But the percentage of riders actively doping has massively dropped from what it was 20 years ago. And 3 scandals, I think, have a lot to do with it. The Festina scandal, Lance Armstrong, and the death of Marco Pantani, the pirate. They have a massive bearing on cultural shifts within the sport that tolerated for too long the doping, the systemic doping. Too long was it tolerated by the sport. Now it's cleaning its act up. Riders are still testing positive, and that in itself is a problem. Not as in the numbers they were. There's less positive tests now than what there were. But the Lance Armstrong scandal has damaged the public perception. So when I'm watching Tour de France now, I know some of those riders will have doped or are currently doping. And I'm now more indifferent. And, well, you could say lifetime bans, but then David Miller would have been ostracised from the sport. He did clean up his act, and he advocates for a clean sport. But at the time he was riding, and you listen to with Tyler Hamilton's interview, and he did say, yeah, the clean racers did have their own nicknames. But then you bring into question things like legends like Eddie Merckx and what he did for the sport, and other riders of his era, and retrospectively awarding the titles to riders who didn't test positive. And then you need to be very, very careful, because the doping regulations keep changing. And when Lance Armstrong was found guilty of all his breaches, they had to try and retroactively award the Tour de France wins to other riders. And they found out that the guy, Jan Ullrich, who won the Tour before Lance Armstrong, had also tested positive during that period with failed tests, so they couldn't award it to him. Contador had tested positive, and he was riding at the time. Has tested positive, couldn't award it to him. Floyd Landis couldn't award it to him because they stripped his one. And they worked out how many riders actually post Armstrong had tested positive, and they were like, well, if we award the Tour win to this rider, it was like the '88 Olympic 100 meter final. Only one athlete's never tested positive, and that was the guy who finished last. The most doped Olympics in history, with 85% of the athletes, if we're going by today's doping standards, were doping on banned substances. At the time, were probably not, because of the rules. So it become retroactively and retrospectively awarding medals and titles again is a flawed concept, because doping regulations change, but it just shows the difficulty that sports have. But I think going forward, yeah, the bans need to be more stringent, but they have to look at the mitigating circumstances, the age of the athlete. The athlete's very, very young. you have to look at the people around them, and should his coaches or team managers or her coaches as well, hers, females, women, you have to look at the age of the athlete, who is around the athlete or the athletes if it's a team situation, their active involvement, their knowledge, um, and those advising them as well. Because doping, an athlete doesn't go one day, you know what, I'm going to pump myself with anabolics or EPO or peptides. There needs to be someone administering and advising them on these things. And you have to look at their coaches and the medical staff and people involved in the day to day, fitness, the physios. You have to look at these people and go, right, okay, how many more athletes does this physio, this coach, this agent have involved? And it really starts raising questions about the integrity of the wider sport, and it becomes a big murky area. But you have to look at the minute game circumstances. The age of the athlete, I do think, has a bearing to play. If it's an older athlete, I have less sympathy for him. I have a lot of less sympathy for him than a younger athlete. Older athletes have been around the sport for longer. They should know better. I think then you have to look at the therapeutic use exemptions. That's something that's come up a lot in recent years as well. And Chris Froome, his asthma being so bad that he needs an inhaler. If it was that bad, he would not be cycling up a mountain on Mont Ventoux. That's where I get a little bit dubious. I've got mates who've got asthma who can barely walk down the road, who are on the same inhaler he is on. So I'm sorry, I find that very hard to believe that a high-level pro athlete can cycle with that level of asthma. I'm sorry. That's where I get dubious over. He says he's clean, but hey, this is the sport of cycling, and now that I'm older, and the Lance Armstrong, Floyd Landis, and Festina scandals have happened in my lifetime, and I've seen the aftermath of these and the damage it's done to the integrity of the sport over the last 22 years. I shouldn't be this cynical, but unfortunately I am. But I have enjoyed this year's Tour de France. I've enjoyed recent Tour de France. Is actually just watching individual stages and going, actually, it's quite entertaining to watch. I like watching it in the background. I find it a very nice watch, and I don't mind having it on the background, and I enjoy it. But if someone is abusing a TUE, a therapeutic use exemption, that's, in my eyes, that's exactly the same as doping and taking a prohibited substance. You need to have medical clearance to have these medications. And again, we can debate this. It's been debated for years. The TUEs, the teams will always try and find a loophole, but I feel that are these loopholes being abused? Absolutely. But to retroactively, look, I mean, I know individual players in rugby league, rugby union, ice hockey, football have been done for performance enhancing drug use. Is there a problem there? Yeah. Is it systemic where teams are actually doping all their players? Probably not. We've had the peptide scandal. We've had the Essendon and Cronulla and other associated teams in AFL and NRL involved in that, and individual players. I mean, Sandor Earl was the one who was really hung out to dry as a player. He's playing with. I felt you could say Asada and the NRL really threw him under the bus. The Essendon players and the Cronulla players took less crap from the governing bodies in Asada than they should have. The coaches involved, that's again murky, because the AFL, I think, dealt with it different to the NRL. Flanagan, the former Cronulla Sharks coach, was given a ban related to his punishment from the peptide scandal for 2 years. So there's question marks over why is he still an assistant coach at St George Dragons, St George Illawarra Dragons in the NRL. But we have seen individual players across professional team sports getting done for TUEs and blood doping and peptides and anabolics on an individual basis. And Sherry, the Cronulla Sharks centre, he's a young player. It's been rumoured that he's been doping since youth level, when he was in junior and reserve grade, before he even made it to the NRL on an individual basis for years. You look at how his speed and his size. and for his age, that raised a lot of questions about. And we know that in amateur club rugby, in rugby league, in what they call bush league, which is the amateur, grassroots, Sunday kind of league kind of thing, semi-pro, doping is a massive problem, and we know that Asada and all that are banning players and ex-pros who retired. Obviously, do some charity games out in the bush, and they are shocked by how many of these young players and some of the older players are actually doping, and how coaches are saying you won't play unless you dope. And that's a problem because it's less strictly governed. And what we've seen with the Olympics is states wanted doping for decades, since the Cold War. So, yeah, when you're watching the Olympics, the athletes clean. No, you look at the Olympics from Atlanta onwards. Are the sports cleaner? Yes. Are we seeing retroactive medals being awarded? Unfortunately, so. Athletes are still testing positive and having their samples retested from Olympics going back to, I think, Athens and Beijing. So it's a problem. It is a problem. And it's now, if you're talking not outside the Russia, Chinese kind of sphere of athletes, if you're talking about athletes in Europe and North America, it's more individual training camps and individual coaches and individual athletes. But if you look at the Russians and the Chinese, that is state-sponsored doping still. It's still, I think. And in Russia, it's about 70% of their Olympic program is doping because they're not talented enough to do it on natural talent alone. So they try to get any and every advantage possible. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. There's some really interesting questions, some interesting differences on opinion, which is always good to see. But it's nearly 9 o'clock. I've got to put dinner on. I've got work in the morning, so I'm going to call that a night. Thank you very, very much for watching all your questions and all your input. Really interesting. And we've ended on a very interesting point. Very interesting point. Cheating and doping in sport. And that's something that is not going away. It's less prevalent than what it was in the 80s and the 90s. There's more strict regulation. Some sports, however, still have a reputation for not being as clean as they should be. And other sports, there are allegations at amateur, semi-pro and professional level that either individual teams, individual athletes, or the sport itself still have systemic problems. And you look at rugby in South Africa, yes, there's issues there. Is it every South African parent? No. Is it every youth player? No. Is it every team? No. Rugby league, we've had our big scandals of the 2010s. Is it still happening? Yeah, there are individual players still testing positive in the last. There's been 2 high-profile players in the last 12 months. Is it every team? No. Is it every player? Is it happening? Yes. Rugby league and rugby union over here in Europe. Is it happening? Yes, players are testing positive for recreational and steroids. Every team? No. Is it still there? Is there an undercurrent? Yes. Are the governing bodies doing enough? Probably not. Are they taking that situation and that issue too lightly? Yes. But there are problems with funding and all sorts. We discussed that in another video. Anyway, for now, thank you very much for watching, and an interesting point to leave on. I think we can pick it up from there next time. And I might do a video on doping in sport for the channel at some point in the next couple of weeks. Keep your eyes peeled, because I think it's a very interesting debating point that we should not underestimate. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon. And